Hello, today I would like to speak to you about Phillis Wheatley. Phillis Wheatley is mainly known as the first African American in North America to have work published. Her work consists of poems that she wrote beginning at the age of 12. Unfortunately, Miss Wheatley did not leave behind any personal journals or personal letters, so very little is known about her as a person. We do know, though, that she was born in 1753 in the western part of Africa. When she was 7 years old, she was captured and brought to the colonies on a ship called the Phillis. When she landed in Boston, she was sold into slavery. A family named the Wheatleys purchased her. Mr. Wheatley bought her to serve his wife. The Wheatleys, though, were very unique for their time. Both Mr. and Mrs. Wheatley were very well educated, and they both were very devout Christians. Mrs. Wheatley believed that regardless of race, everyone needed to be treated with respect. As a matter of fact, the Wheatleys treated Phillis more like a daughter than they did a slave. Reportedly, Mr. Wheatley even said to her, quote, "You're my black child, you're my Phillis," unquote. The Wheatleys soon realized that Phillis was a very intelligent little girl, and she was very curious and eager to learn. So Mrs. Wheatley and her daughter began to teach the little girl to read and write in English. She was a very apt student, and soon she was able to read works of Homer, Keats, and Pope. She began writing poetry when she was only 12 years old. In addition to reading those three great authors, she also read and reread the Bible, and this would greatly influence her work, since most of her poems dealt with Christianity or with moral issues. While Wheatley had a much easier life than most slaves, she was still aware that she was not free. The Wheatleys would not allow her to be friends with uneducated slaves. And at that time, not a lot of slaves were educated, especially as well as Phillis. The Wheatleys had her accompany them when they would visit their white friends. But Phillis herself would request to be seated away from the white families while they dined. So Phillis seemed to be aware that she was not a part of the black slave culture, nor was she a part of the white slave owner culture. Phillis continued to write, and her poems were soon published in the colonies and in England. They were very well received in England, and she received a request to come to England and talk about her poetry. She did so. She accompanied the Wheatley's son to England. While she was there, reportedly she was to even meet with the King of England to read some of her poems. However, while she was there, Mrs. Wheatley became gravely ill, and Mr. Wheatley requested that she return home to help him care for her. She did so. But this is where there have been two different ideas put forth about historians regarding Phillis's freedom. These two different ideas show Miss Wheatley in very different lights, and this is a case where personal diaries or letters might give us insight into her thoughts and motivations. However, the outcome was that Mrs. Wheatley was granted her freedom. Unfortunately, she faced dark times ahead. Mrs. Wheatley, when she was older, married a man who was not successful, so they lived a very poor life. And she had 3 children who all died young. Professionally, Mrs. Wheatley tried to publish another book of poetry, but her popularity had waned when she was no longer seen as a slave poet. Never being strong physically, Miss Wheatley died when she was only 31 years old. A last note about Miss Wheatley's popularity as a poet. George Washington and Ben Franklin were fans of her work, but Thomas Jefferson was very critical of her. He wrote that her work was, quote, below the dignity of criticism, unquote. I would be very curious to know more about why he was so very critical of her work. Thank you.